First, we'd like to thank the Museum of Art and especially Wilson Bain for their invitation and for bringing me here today. And thank you for joining us for this presentation on, as the title says, Van Gogh and French literature. So the way I designed my presentation is to give you a survey of the literary history, literary movements throughout the 19th century, all the way up to naturalism, which was the most important movement for Van Gogh. And as also, I want to present the parallel evolution of art and the avant-garde movements at the same time in Paris and in France, all the way to the Impressionism. As I do this, I'll make a quick pauses between my different sections so you can breathe a little, me too. And if you have any questions at that point, I'd be happy to answer them. So we don't have to wait for the Q&A at the end. I hope we'll have 10 to 15 minutes for further discussion, but feel free to just jump in if you have something in mind. All right, so I'm going to make a few hints at the exhibit. I don't know if you've seen it. Went to see it on Sunday and was pretty impressed with the work I saw. I was also very surprised when I started looking into the Van Gogh's correspondence, because he was a prolific writer of letters to his family and to his friends, especially his brother Theo. And that's where all the information is mainly based, especially for a literary scholar as myself. Looking at the text and finding evidence, you have plenty to work with when you look at his writings. So it's a three-volume set of the complete letters. And the first thing that struck me was the breadth of his reading and of his knowledge of literature, especially French literature, but not only, also British literature. Throughout the letters. So it starts in the 70s when he moves to Paris as an apprentice in an art dealership, and all the way to the last weeks of his life, always talking about literature. Some scholars have taken the time to count, and he mentions no less than 150 authors and 800 works of literature. Among them, pride of place for Émile Zola, the French naturalist, who was the promoter of this movement and tended to present a theoretical aspect to his work of literature. But it was not just Zola that Van Gogh was interested in. French writers also included Victor Hugo, Honoré de Balzac, Gustave Flaubert, the Goncourt brothers, Alphonse Daudet, Guy de Maupassant, just to name a few, because there are more. And also, as I was talking about British literature, George Eliot, Charles Dickens, and Thomas Carlyle. Van Gogh is referred to by a scholarship as and I'm quoting, avid or even voracious reader. And he told once his brother Theo that books and reality and art, and this is a quote from Van Gogh, books and reality and art are the same kind of thing for me. So there's an equation in his vision of art and literature with life, with reality. And they present a lens for him to look at life and to make sense of his art. So that's what I'll be discussing today, with some contextualization about the way the artistic movements in France evolved throughout the century. Mainly, literature was a way for him to make sense of his artistic calling and of major events in his life. So there's a biographical aspect and an aesthetic aspect to his relationship to literature. It was often a filter through which he deciphered the world around him, and it's therefore not surprising that the literary discussions he had in his letters and the references that he made have such a presence in his work. Van Gogh, moreover, was always asking friends and relatives to read the books he was the most enthusiastic about. And that's something that he always does his letters to his brother Theo. Have you read this book? Have you read the book? Have you read the book? I told you to read this book. Same thing for his sister. So it really was insistent. It's like, this is a major work. You must read it. And he felt that one had to be acquainted with modern literature, that it was non-negotiable, basically. And in fact, to me, and that's I'm just proposing this this aspect of Van Gogh's relationship to literature. It seems that it was famously hot-tempered, maybe somewhat at times reclusive as an artist and a person. It seemed that literature constituted a way to relate to others and to connect with people through his enthusiasm for literature, for certain literary texts. This passion for books and modern novels in particular is certainly reflected by his inclusion of colorful paperback volumes, as you can see behind me, as a thematic elements in his paintings, in particular his still lifes. Here you see two novels, and it's interesting to note that he's including, typically, almost in all instances, the paperback volumes that you could buy at the time at a bookseller or a bookshop. They're not bound, not covered in a leather customized cover that typically owners of books would ask a binder to create for them. Instead, you see the cheap yellow or blue cover. It's something that could deteriorate easily. That's why people actually created book bindings for their own volumes in their personal library. But he wants to present those as if to highlight the consumption of modern literature, something that has just been picked up from the bookstore, something that advertises how current the literature is with the title, the name of the author, and not all the books that he represents have the title, have something legible on them. You'll see in the next slide. But here you can see distinctly two works, one by the Goncourt brothers, which is Germinie La Certeuse. It's the story of a maid that has a secret life, and you discover what this old maid, how she was living in Paris, something that is very in touch with social realism. And the other one is a novel by Maupassant, Bellamy, which is the story of a ruthless journalist that makes his way up into society by using women and becoming successful as the process goes. So as I was saying, you don't always see a clear title, as if Van Gogh wanted to advertise his own passion for certain novels and certain authors, certain writers in his still lifes. Sometimes it's just a bunch of books, but still colorful, so it's part of his work on color, but including literature as a thematic backdrop and an actual element in the paintings. This one was, I believe, entitled, it does not reflect it in the title, but he referred it to Parisian novels. So again, insisting on how contemporary the work was. It's not classic novels, it's modern naturalist novels. So as I said, he used literature to relate to people by engaging them to read, and also by placing strategically some books in his paintings. And I'm going to show you two examples, two portraits that he made at the end of his life. One is the famous L'Arlésienne, which is a portrait of the bar and restaurant owner in Arles when he was there in the south of France in 88, 89. So on this picture, the first one the first version that he painted, you see that she has gloves and a little umbrella. So it's very typical of a feminine character, something that is sitting as she's kind of daydreaming, sitting at the table. But then in a reworking of this same portrait, the one that is at the Met in New York, he includes the books. So these books, like in the still life, do not have a legible title. It's not something specific, but it's a clear inclusion of literature, as if he felt a need to include books and modern literature in the painting to present her as someone who is knowledgeable about reading modern stuff and as someone who's interested in it. I believe she was not, and scholarship says she probably didn't read them, but to Van Gogh it was important to create this connection. Same thing with the portrait of Dr. Gachet in 1890, so that's in Auvers-sur-Oise at the end of his life. In this painting, you see flowers, probably lilac, I don't know. And in the reworking of the same portrait, which is in a private collection now, again, books. So here you can read the titles of the novels. Again, Germigny-Lacerteux by the Goncourt brothers. And then the second one is Manette Salomon, also by the Goncourt brothers. And apparently, from the letters, we can infer that he suggested that Dr. Paul Gachet read the novels. The doctor was not interested in modern literature, thinking it's kind of bad stuff. You don't want to read that. It's not very moral. It's not suitable to read these. But kind of a tongue-in-cheek inclusion, Van Gogh reworked the portrait and included the two books. So again, kind of this impulse to create connections with other human beings through literature. So to highlight the role that literature played for Van Gogh in his life and in his work as an artist, I will attempt to weave together a short panorama of literary and artistic movements in the 19th century as a backdrop to explain the cultural importance of the French literary scene and the artistic scene as well in general for Van Gogh, and especially explaining how Paris was seen and perceived and lived as a center for the arts. I will then turn to the importance of naturalism, in particular for Van Gogh, and how he related as a kind of kindred spirit to Zola. And I will talk in further details about his appropriation and adherence to the tenets of naturalism. Before I go on, I just add another last example. I wanted to talk about it. I really like this painting, and I don't want to keep it for the end, so we're going to talk about it now. It's a painting. It's a traditional image, subject of a woman reading. I'm showing you one example among many. This is Fragonard in the 18th century, which is a young girl reading. It's usually young girls, but you would expect that they're reading more appropriate literature that is meant for young girls to educate them. And we know that novels was not appropriate for women to read. So when you move on to the later part of the 19th century, you have Henri Fantin-Latour depicting here his sister as a woman reading. She looks very proper. The hair is all kept up. She's reading a book. We don't know what it is exactly, but by her appearance and the attitude of her reading on this sofa, you would also be able to infer that she's reading something proper as she appears. In Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec, things are starting to get a little more unkempt, if you will. Women reading still, the book doesn't look like something that would not be appropriate. It seems that she's either not happy to read it or very intensely reading it. But when you move on to the painting by Van Gogh, you see that it's a different setting. It's no longer the domestic space that is usually associated with women, with a young woman. She seems to be in a library or a bookshop, because that's how I view it. You see the shelves with the books behind, and you see the ladder, to go up and reach for the books. And she's reading a book with a very bright paper cover, so a paperback that might also be a modern novel that she probably shouldn't be reading. Judging by the way she is dressed, she might be from the middle class, but probably even like a literate working class. We know that in Paris you had a lot of reading rooms, as they were called. So it was libraries for the people, where people could come in, and for a fee they could browse newspapers, have access to some books. So I don't know exactly what is intended here, but we know from a letter to his sister that Van Gogh referred to this painting not as a woman reading, but a woman reading novels. So he, again, insisted on the fact that novels and modern novels, because we can tell this is a modern one that was just published because of the bright cover, were very important for him, and even a suggested reading for women, like he would for his sister, insisting that she read naturalist novels that would have been very improper for her to read. And she was not very interested either. So, with this, I turn to the literary movements of the 19th century. I'm just going to give you a quick run-through of how the idea of the artist, the engaged artist, working for his art and defending his ideas and creating novelty by rejecting the tradition came to be in the 19th century. And it's really something that is still true today. That's what we could say defined modernity, by the rejection of the past and the creation of something new looking forward. So for the 19th century, you have a lot of isms. So it's the century of a lot of movements and ideas and ideologies. Romanticism, obviously, is the first one. Realism is kind of a way into naturalism later in the century. And then symbolism was the one that kind of replaced purposefully and with the pure intent of replacing naturalism in Paris in the 1880s. So I'll start with Victor Hugo. With Victor Hugo, you have the idea of the individual artist working for his art as an individual genius. That's something that was created in the Italian Renaissance, the idea of an original artist that has a vision of his own work, of his own art, and puts it forth in his work. And Victor Hugo certainly embraced that vision because he decided that he was going to be the romantic leader in France. And so he was for almost all of the century. So the tenets of art were very academic at the time. France, especially, being centralized as it was, and it had been since Louis XIV, had a concentration in Paris, and it worked also for the arts. So there were several academies regulating all aspects of art: music, dance, architecture, visual arts, painting, sculpture, literature. Everything was regimented, if you will. And because of that, and because of the ways that you could produce and be known and find patrons, everything had to kind of fall into the mold. And that was certainly true until the end of the 18th century, when philosophers, as Diderot, for example, started to criticize this idea of a hierarchy and a very classified vision of genres. So Victor Hugo was certainly appealed to that vision of breaking apart the mold. And he viewed his revolution in art as the revolution in politics that happened in 1789 in France, the Great Revolution, and also the other revolutions happening every 10 years for quite a while. So the idea of art being revolutionary and being engaged and being a reaction and a rejection of the previous generation, and thinking in terms of generational terms was very, very crucial for the avant-garde movements of the 19th century. And I would say it really starts with Victor Hugo, who posits this position as something that has to be for an artist. An artist must be self-aware and have a vision of his career and what he's doing with his work. So Victor Hugo would always start his work, his volumes, with a preface, sometimes rather long, but they're very famous now for the theorization that he was doing in his art. So I'm just presenting how Hugo, being Hugo, did it all in theater first, because that was the place where you could find success by public performances on the Parisian stage, but also in poetry, which was the higher standard of art. In 1829, he wrote The Orientals, which created an uproar, because all the classicists were very surprised by the form and the content also. And I'll come back to this again. Artists in the 19th century really worked with the subject matter, expanding what you could include in the works, and also working on the form, the format of the aspect of the work. And it's very important for texture, color, and lines in visual arts. And so Last but not least, especially for the 19th century, because prose and the novel will become the first genre, the most popular, the most widely publicized and circulated, Notre-Dame de Paris, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, was published in 1831. So with each of these volumes, Victor Hugo is purposefully, intently pushing the boundaries of what French literature is and can do, and especially with the preface to Cromwell in 1827, which is now kind of a classic of literary theory in France. He suggested that the very rigid structure that kind of placed a constraint on French letters was to be discarded completely. He kept one thing, the unity of action in a play, but otherwise he said anything goes. It is up to the artist, with his original vision, with his artistic freedom, to decide what is best for his work. So one has to decide for oneself. There is no kind of set of ideas that one must work within to create art. Art is a personal expression. So that was very revolutionary for the time, and it was very popular with the Romantic movement, because they were like, yes, that's really what I want to do, especially in the visual arts, and I'll come back to that because it was much more regulated. So in 1830, he finally is able to produce and perform a play, Hernani, and it's the famous Battle of Hernani, when the young romantics came to support and be la claque, as we say, people who would applaud and get excited after every line to kind of support the play by Victor Hugo. And on the other side, you had the classicists who would boo, and they would kind of try to shut up the performers on stage, the actors, kind of shout to cover the lines and be scandalized by the way the verses were written, and by the subject, the content of it all. So that's a famous representation of the young man. It's like kind of hippie style against the very proper bourgeois, and that was the clash. The issue with this revolution in art was that by opening up the idea of what is beautiful, what can be represented in art, meant that sometimes what is ugly or what is accepted as ugly will be included in works that should not be considered as capable of including that. So there's a caricature that is famous too, where you see the leader of the Romantic movement with this very large forehead, which is the sign of genius according to phrenology at the time. So you'll see Victor Hugo in all the photographs and the paintings that he always has his hair backwards, so he can present the large genius front. Followed by all the famous Romantic writers at the time. I don't have time to mention them all, but you can see that there are quite a few. Alexandre Dumas is the one carrying all the books because he produced a lot. And the saying goes, the ugly is the beautiful, or ugly is the new beautiful. At the same time, you had Balzac, and I'm mentioning him here in the Romantic period because he's considered usually a realist writer, but his realism is not quite the one that was going to be theorized later on in the century. So his vision is very interesting because he wants to create a full panorama of society in France, and in Paris in particular, by leaving no stone unturned, except for the working class. That's the one that you don't really see in his novels. But otherwise, he wanted to bring together all the different facets of society by having a global picture, if you will. And that's the human comedy, the 95 plus novels and novellas that he gathered under that umbrella title. And it was very famous for creating recurring characters. So you were looking at a saga. It was a very self-contained world where all the characters would reappear from novel to novel, and you would see them evolve in life, evolve in society, and it was something that made sense. It was very coherent as a fictional world. So that was kind of the first attempt by a novelist and by an artist to represent society so exhaustively, and it kind of gave people ideas about what you could do with going forward with art. So I'm giving you a quote that's a little long, but I'll guide you through it. That's Edmond Duranty, who was a very fervent promoter of realism in mid-century. So the text is from 1856. By that time, Flaubert was working on his novel, was about actually to publish Madame Bovary, which kind of was recuperated as a realist novel, even though he didn't want to have anything to do with it. But what the quote is saying, and I'm just giving you highlights here in bold, is that what romantic and classical novels were doing were very psychological. They were looking at the story of the souls in characters. So what goes on in one's mind, in one's soul. So it's the life of the spirit, if you will. But he was saying we're missing the conditions, the practical conditions of life. What about practical life? The way we live, all of us, in reality. Because it's very well to have like those very sentimental novels in the romantic spirit about dreams and visions, but what about concrete reality? And so he looked at the great divisions of professions, that's what he says, that make man. And by this, he's already influenced by Balzac. Balzac, who created social types according to social levels, according to professions, according to where they lived. So all of that was already some kind of deterministic factors about social characters in the work of Balzac. And what the realists want to do is continue and push this further. So they want to see what the existence and what the man is, and by man, women too. And so that's really where we're moving towards by the mid-century, and then Zola will come in. All right, so I'll move to the avant-garde in the visual arts. So as I was saying, academic art, or what you would call here beaux-arts, was very, very regulated with a lot of rules. There was a certain way of doing things. There was a very strong hierarchy of genres. So it started with historical painting, anything that included mythology, reference to classical history, ancient history, antiquity, kings, heroes, anything. That was number one. And then you would move on to portraiture. So portraits of nobles, of kings. That was a very official genre too. And then you'd move on to genre paintings. And genre paintings were all the scenes of daily lives that you can find in Dutch or the northern schools of paintings from the 17th century, 18th century. Little figures from the people, but without kind of the social acuteness that you find in the 19th century. And then you go down and you have landscapes. And landscapes to us, with all those artists now from the 19th century, seems very important. But at the time, it was considered a lower thing, because it was just like paint trees in the background. But what is very important is all this tragic action or historical action going on. And then last, still lifes. And those two in modern art are very important. So modern art kind of twists that, or like on its head, by placing more and more with the open air or like outdoors painting, placing landscapes first, still lives, portraiture too, but of different people, the common people, the middle class, and no longer like cleaving the higher genres to what was called l'art pompier. So this official art, but with by the labeling of art pompier is like pomp. So it's very pejorative. It's just criticizing what it was. So just to run you quickly through the main artists that can be like beacons along the way. You had David. At the end of the 18th century, it was like the neoclassical painter with this famous painting of 1784, the Oaths of the, I don't know how to pronounce this, Horatii, I was told. So all the lines, geometry, antiquity, classical architecture, this is the stuff. And that's what will define academic art in the 19th century. And you had to go through the salon to be known as an artist. And the salon was this usually yearly, but sometimes biennial, exhibit in Paris where you get selected by a committee that came from the academies and the schools of arts. And if you could get in, then you'd be exposed for a few weeks, and you could receive a prize, an official prize. And sometimes you would get, the state would order paintings from you, or would buy your paintings and put them in the museums. And patrons could actually go in the rooms, look at what was on, and they'd say, oh, I want this artist. I want him to paint something for me. So that was the main venue to get famous and become a successful artist. But you had to get in. So you had to go by the rules. So what the Romantics started to do was kind of pushing the boundaries, as Hugo was doing in literature and theater. And that's a painting of the 1824 Salon. The prizes are being distributed by the king. So it's very official. It's a very pompous moment. By then, Delacroix was putting forth his first paintings, and he was really doing something different. So I'm showing you a few of his paintings that created kind of a scandal at the time. He's working a lot with color, with blurred lines. He's using, as I said, again, a very different subject matter. He's taking no longer classical antiquity and mythology, but he's going, using Dante in Inferno, to present something that has much more influence by Baroque, for one thing, but also is less insistent on the lines and the precision of the painting, but much more about the energy, the passion, with a lot of colors. And that was going to be even worse in 1827, which is the Salon that is famous for bringing forth the Romantic school and having a clash of the classicists on one hand and the Romantics on the other. That's the death of Sardanapalus, which is chaos of colors and forms. Delacroix really was, like, he felt like he could push the boundaries. It was happening at the exact same time with Hugo in literature. And this is something that made it in the Salon, surprisingly, but people were not happy. So you have a caricature just to illustrate a little anecdotal representation of, will they go in? Will they not? Are they going to be part of the selection for this year's Salon? So it was very much something that was in the air. People were aware of this revolutionary movement trying to push, and get through the door and push the boundaries and the limits of art. And Delacroix is a major influence on Van Gogh. I'm just giving you one example. I think it might be referenced in the gallery. This is the Pietà by Delacroix on the left, and then that is the copy that Van Gogh made later in life. So after the Romantics, again, what? Realism, and pushing the boundaries even further with the subject matter, because form was already being broken with the Romantics. But now we're going to move to some more socially grounded representations. And one major scandal of the 19th century was this painting by Courbet, which is The Burial at Ornans. 4950, that's the Second Republic, so upheaval in France. And what comes out? A funeral with simple people, but the size of a history painting. It's 10 feet high, 20 feet long. It's in Musée d'Orsay today, and you can see it. It's pretty impressive. People were really, really dissatisfied with this idea that you could present something so banal, even though it's a serious matter, a burial, but something so simple. And Courbet, being Courbet, he did it on purpose, obviously, pushing the limits and twisting the genre on its head. It's like, I'm going to give you a grand painting about this scene. And he kept doing it. The same year, you had this painting, which was very grounded on social realism, The Stonebreakers. This is no longer in existence. It was destroyed during World War II. But we have this representation. And so you see more and more the appearance of the working class in art as a legitimate subject. It was being done in the novels, and it's also being done now in painting. That's for the working class, the urban class, if you will. something the bourgeoisie was not very happy about. But if you move to another form, the peasants, the peasantry, that was a much more okay subject because it was more nostalgic. It looked back in time. It looked back at the roots of France, the countryside. So it's something that was more permissible. And Millet really was famous for putting forth such paintings. This is the Angelus, the most famous painting by Millet, probably. And it's one of Van Gogh's favorite artists. This painting, for example, was also copied at the end of his life by Van Gogh. It seemed that he was going back to his inspirations. And by the 1889, that's when he had nervous breakdowns and he was internalized. He volunteered to go in Saint-Rémy in the asylum. And by then he was really looking back on what was very inspirational for his art. So you have this representation that is a copy of Millet by Van Gogh. And again, by then in the mid-century, landscape becomes a very important genre. With the Barbizon school, for example, the painters who would go in the forest of Fontainebleau or go in the countryside just to paint on site. That is something revolutionary as well, because you were supposed to do sketches in a sketchbook, go back to the studio and create from memory because there was an intellectual process. What the artists are doing then is saying, no, I want to have the impressions, hence the Impressionists, and I want to create something that is in touch with reality, with the actual spectacle of life outside nature, people, the society around me, the environment. A few examples of major influences on Van Gogh: Jules Dupré, Charles d'Aubigny. You have examples in the galleries as well. But as if it was not enough, more scandal, Edouard Manet comes in the picture. So here you can understand the irony and kind of the rebellious aspect of the avant-garde. Avant-garde, by the way, is a military term saying it's the unit that goes out first in the battlefield to attack and receive the brunt of the battle before the rest of the army. So there were really those people who really wanted confrontation. And so they did, because this painting obviously is a mix of classical nudity, classical nude, the female, in the middle of a picnic. So one could say she just went bathing in the background. You have her counterpart there, but and it was called the bath at the beginning. And then he said, oh no, let's call it a picnic on the lawn. So a huge uproar in the salon. Actually, this one was not accepted. It's 63 was rejected, never made it, but it went to the Salon des Refusés, which is the rejected paintings, and Napoleon III realized people were so upset that we can never get into the salon, we'll never get comments and like public orders or whatever. So they created a second salon, the Salon of the rebellious artists, the rejected from the official one. So this one was finally put up and for the public to see, but only after they created that second rejected salon. So Manet thought about what he was doing and said, I can do better than that, and finally got in the salon in 63. With a nude woman too. What was very shocking at the time is that a lot of little details tell you that she is a prostitute who's living the good life with very wealthy patrons and clients, customers. And so it's no longer a classical nude. It's not an allegory of any sorts. It's not a deity. It's not a nymph. No, it is your neighbor's prostitute. So it's just by the setting. Like you look at the furniture, you look at the little shoes she's wearing, the fact that she's naked on a bed that is undone. It's probably afterwards, and she's receiving flowers for her good qualities. But the worst thing is that she's looking at you, and that was not okay. That was a very confrontational gaze, and people were very displeased. It was kind of this rebellious attitude of the, I would say, working class girl or lower class girl, and the painter too, who is presenting her that way. So there's an association between the artist, the rebellious artist, and this confrontational figure from the people. And it's really pushing the upper class, or the bourgeois juste milieu. So the gaze was the issue a lot. And the setting can let you know that she's not on Mount Olympus, no. So I'll go quickly over there were more that caused an uproar by Courbet. I think he really liked that. And then we move on to Impressionism. So it's the same system. It's the same idea of pushing the boundaries of drawing, the design, and the lines, and the colors, and becoming more and more impressionistic. So we're moving forward to a personal vision from the artist. So the rules of art are just what the artist sets for himself. And that's really where all the movements move along more and more quickly, because there's a development of every decade. You have a new movement, a new theory, a new proposal of an artist that kind of creates a movement in a group in a school. Even if some don't want to be associated with them, you see that modern art constantly evolves that way, by rejecting, pushing, exploring, expanding things. So it leaves behind the arrière-garde for this time, not the avant-garde, but the one that's left behind, and is still doing this academic painting for official monuments and buildings. But this is where art is. And to Van Gogh, this was very stimulating, very exciting. And in his mind, everything was associated. Literature, what literature was doing, what painting was doing, were one and the same thing. So we finally get to Zola. For Zola, society had to be represented fully, like Balzac had done, but Balzac had left out the working class. And at the time of Zola, the industrialization of France, the expansion of urbanization meant that there was a new parts of society that had to be represented and had to be acknowledged in art. And art had part of what literature could do was to shed light on certain aspects, certain social issues of the time. So it was not afraid of looking at poverty, alcoholism, prostitution, exploitation, strikes, unionizing. All of this is in all of his novels, and Van Gogh loved it, because it really matched what Van Gogh was experiencing in the different situations of his life, different stages of his life in Belgium and the Netherlands. Thinking back about his time in London. So he was really in touch with this. It was very acute for him. And there's one quote that I want to read to you that really shows how he looked at the world around him. After Zola's? Which trial are you talking about? Oh, you're talking about J'accuse, the Dreyfus affair? That's much before. What happened with Zola creating his saga of the Rougon-Macquart, the 20 novels of a family that evolves, and he calls it a natural and social history of a family under the Second Empire. So it's very grounded in a very specific period, very specific time and place. He becomes this intellectual that has something to say, a voice in society, in the public sphere. And that's how he kind of creates the figure of the intellectual. And when the Dreyfus affair unfolded in 1898, 96, 98, that's when he publishes I accuse the government, I accuse the minister, I accuse the Ministry of War of having done this, this, and this, and that. And there was a big op-ed on the first page of L'Aurore, the newspaper. And J'accuse, yeah. So that's afterwards, but he's already famous for not being afraid of jumping in the pool and getting in action. If I can find my quote. Basically, what it's from a letter from 1876. So it's when Van Gogh is for the first time in Paris. He's writing to his brother, and he says that what's beautiful about Paris is not so much the autumn atmosphere around him, the environment, the churches, but he says the poor people that I see. That's where beauty is. And so that's something that's very dear to him. And so when he is trying to find his calling in life, and he thinks he might be an evangelical minister, he goes to Belgium, and there he realizes that he really wants to fraternize. Is that a word? I don't know. With the workers in the coal fields of Belgium. And that's something that he starts developing in his art. So he starts making drawings, and later on, when he really realizes that he wants to be an artist, that's what he paints. And when he's in The Hague, when he finally decides that he's going to be an artist, he wants to be a graphic designer first, so it's a lot of pencil drawings in ink. He says that what he's interested in is looking at the poor people around him. So I'll just show you a few pictures. So that these were representations of what was going on before him, and we can talk about it later during the Q&As. But he has plenty and plenty of those drawings, and it's something that goes back to Millet, the one who was painting the rural people in France. So it's kind of a traditional outlook on the working class, but the more you go, the less it is the rural people, and the more it is the urban poor. A few examples: the soup kitchen in the Netherlands. Then the poor and money, so it looks like they're queuing to get some help. Or the miners in the fields. Or the weavers. And finally, he makes his first complete large painting in 1885, which is the potato eaters. And he has a revelation. He finds a Zola novel, which is L'Assommoir, which is about this woman, this poor working class woman in the suburbs of Paris who will die from alcoholism. And he says, this is it. What Zola is doing in his novel, this is my painting. This is the same thing. We're looking at the real life of the real people. And he's really excited to see a connection there. And he always is trying to find a connection between what he reads and what he paints, even though there's no exact parallels, because he was never, even though he wanted to be a graphic designer, but he said, I'm not trying to illustrate any scenes from a novel. I'm not a book illustrator. But when I read something, it inspires me and it stays with me. And sometimes it's going to come out. So for example, he said, I just finished reading Germinal by Zola and I had to paint. We don't know what he painted. It's probably not a scene from Zola, but this impulse. It was like food for his creativity. And when he's in Arles towards the last years of his life, he paints this cafe in the little street, and he says, look, it's like the boulevards in Bellamy of Maupassant. When in the first chapter, the character walks on the big boulevards, nothing in comparison, because we're in the south of France, it's a small town. It's just because there are tables, chairs, that he kind of sees this mental image that he has kept from reading the book, and he makes associations like these. He reads Pierre Lottie, for example, another writer, and he's in Arles, in the south of France, and he makes the painting of a young girl who sits for him, and he says, it's La Mousme, it's the Japanese woman from the novel of Lottie in Japan. It's this little girl of 13, 14. It's a typical character in the novel. This girl is not Japanese. She's just a girl from the south of France, but there's a connection here. There's something that he finds in the books, the way it's presented, the way it's painted, because he really talks about the writers as painters with words. This verbal becomes visual. There's a strong connection and strong inspiration between the two. And then I'm finishing with this one because it's in the gallery, so you can go back and look at it. When he goes to the south of France, he says, I'm off to Japan. This is Japan. I am in Japan, in the south of France. The colors, the atmosphere, just the vibe I'm getting is Japan. I just read Lottie. I'm excited about it. I've been collecting Japanese prints all of my life, and this is this is Japan. So that's where he paints the girl. That's what he makes as a connection. And when he paints this painting, it's not quite Japan, the south of France yet, because it's painted in 1887. But you can look in the last room in the gallery how it relates to the Japanese print that is there. And when you compare the two, you really see how he sees nature, especially summer nature with a lot of colors, as a Japanese universe that speaks to him. So there's connections between the art, connections between what the artists were doing, pushing the boundaries, going towards the expression of the self, of the unique vision that was happening in literature, happening in the arts in France, and that he finds a deep, deep, deep connection with on a very personal level in his life, because he looks at it through a lens. It's a filter for him. And also as a way to promote his own vision of the world around him. Thank you very much.